She didn't destroy you. She studied you, not the man you showed her, the fracture you hid. Because some women aren't searching for a partner. They're scanning for advantage. And if you're still asking, how could she do this? You weren't betrayed. You were chosen strategically. Machiavelli would have nodded in silence, not because he hated women, but because he understood power. You thought love meant safety. She thought love meant leverage. And the price of that confusion? Your vision. Your dignity, years of your life, spent orbiting a mask that mirrored your need to matter. This video isn't about her. It's about you. About the blind spots that made her look divine, and the desperation you called destiny. Because what if the pain you're feeling was the first honest thing that's happened to you in years? He didn't fall in love. He collapsed into her warmth, her approval, her illusion. She wasn't home. She was anesthesia. A momentary truce in the war he never admitted he was losing. The war of being a man with no throne, only a hunger to be seen. Most men don't chase women. They chase relief from the ache, the echo, the scar. Her voice sounded like silence after a storm. But it wasn't peace. It was a pause in his self-abandonment. She wasn't medicine. She was the distraction from what he refused to face. A man who hasn't built himself will serve anything that flatters him. And she knew exactly what to flatter. Not his strength, his fracture, not his dreams, his desperation, not who he was, but who he was pretending not to be. The mask she wore wasn't hers. It was crafted by his fantasies, stitched by his voids. He called it connection, but it was compensation for the silence inside him. She didn't deceive him. He needed the deception. Machiavelli was right. Men lose reason when validation feels like power. He thought her smile meant salvation. It just meant she saw the puppet and not the man. Every compliment was a string, every kiss a leash disguised as affection. She didn't offer him love. She offered him escape from his own silence, his own questions, his own weight. He mistook that escape for intimacy. But if it were real, it wouldn't have needed the lie. It wouldn't have hurt this much to lose. He remembers the first time she looked at him like he mattered, and he craves it like a drug. Not because it was love, but because it made him forget his absence. The absence of self-respect, of direction, of spine. And now, alone, that absence screams louder than ever. This was never about her. It was about the part of him that needed her. The wounded animal looking for a place to sleep, even if it was a trap. He called it love, but it was exhaustion disguised as devotion. You gave her loyalty like it was proof of love, but in her eyes, it was proof of control. The more you gave, the less you existed. She didn't feel safer. She felt stronger. Not because of your devotion, but because of your predictability. Every sacrifice you made whispered, "Take more." And she did, not because she's cruel, but because you trained her. Service without sovereignty is just performance. She never respected your kindness. She respected the power it gave her over you. Codependency doesn't feel like a chain. It feels like responsibility. You called it care. She called it convenience. You bent until your identity cracked. And she stayed, not out of love, but because you were easy to control. You became her peace by silencing yourself. Machiavelli knew power is never given, it's taken. And she took yours with a smile. You thought she stayed because you were strong, but she stayed because she knew your pattern. Say yes, serve, apologize, repeat. You didn't love her, you needed her to need you, and that's the most dangerous love of all, the one that erases you. Every time you gave in, you lost definition. And she started seeing you as a function, not a man. She never had to raise her voice. Your guilt did the talking. You turned compromise into obedience and called it commitment. But real love doesn't require you to disappear. The favors you gave her weren't free. They cost your self-worth. And she paid you back with silence, not because she didn't care, but because silence became her currency, and you kept spending yourself just to feel seen. You weren't loyal. You were scared of being alone, of losing her, of confronting your emptiness. She didn't betray your love. She used your fear as leverage, and in the end, you weren't abandoned. You were exhausted. She said the right things at the right time, and you clung to her praise like oxygen, not because it made you strong, but because it numbed your doubt. She didn't crown you a king. She turned you into a puppet, one that smiled on cue. Every compliment was a leash. You performed and she rewarded, not with love, with approval, and that approval became your drug. You stopped asking who you were. You just wanted to stay wanted. Machiavelli warned, "The one who defines your worth owns you." And she did. Softly, skillfully, absolutely. You weren't in a relationship. You were in an emotional feedback loop where your self-esteem rose and fell with her validation. You were never free, because freedom means being unafraid to disappoint. And you feared her disapproval more than your own reflection. She didn't make you a better man. She made you a quieter one, domesticated by praise. She praised your potential, as long as it served her. But the moment your spine reappeared, her affection withered, because she didn't love your truth, she loved your compliance, and you mistook obedience for connection. Every man wants to be seen, but few are ready to be mirrored. And her praise didn't mirror who you were, it mirrored who she needed you to be, so you wore that version like armor until it rusted around your real self. What's worse than being unloved, being loved conditionally, and calling it devotion? She trained you to fear your own voice, to believe silence meant harmony, but that silence cost you your sovereignty. You didn't crave her love, you craved the safety of her words. But safety isn't peace when it demands your disappearance. Her praise didn't liberate you, it imprisoned you, and now you stand in the ruins of your own applause. You didn't love her, you loved how you disappeared in her attention. She wasn't a woman, she was a reflection of the boy who never felt chosen. And you mistook that flash of recognition for fate. Every time she looked at you, you felt real, but only because you'd forgotten how to look at yourself. She became the substitute for the mother who wasn't present, the teacher who didn't listen, the silence you buried under years of pretending to be fine. Jung said, "What we don't make conscious, we repeat," and you repeated your wound, not your will. You weren't drawn to her soul. You were drawn to the ache she resembled. Your heartbreak wasn't personal, it was archetypal. She didn't manipulate you, she read you. Before you spoke, she sensed the fracture. And she offered what every abandoned boy craves, warmth and need, but it was never unconditional. You had to earn it again and again, like a child earning love. You thought your devotion would heal the past, but no woman can be your redemption, especially one who profits from your need. She wasn't cruel, just strategic, and you were starving enough to serve without questioning the cost. You didn't chase her out of love. You chased her because you couldn't stand being alone with yourself. And she gave you something to orbit, even if it drained you, because movement, even in circles, feels better than stillness when you're empty. This is how the cycle works. The man abandons himself, then serves a woman, hoping she'll restore him. But she can't. She was never supposed to. She's just the latest scene in a play you never wrote. And now you hate her for acting the part too well. You say she changed. No, your illusion faded. She mirrored your abandonment because that's what you handed her. You were never in love. You were just addicted to the echo of your oldest scar. You begged her to stay the same, but only because the lie still comforted you. The truth wasn't that she changed. It was that your blindness cracked, and the mask she wore didn't fall. You finally saw it for what it was. Cognitive dissonance is the polite name for self-betrayal. You didn't want to believe she was using you. So you called her complex, traumatized, misunderstood, anything but calculated, because that meant admitting your love wasn't real. It was projection. Machiavelli said, "Vision unclouded by emotion is rare power," but you weren't ready to see. You needed the illusion because the truth threatened the fantasy, and the fantasy was your last comfort, the only thing holding your crumbling identity together. She didn't love you, she just needed you, until she didn't, and you sensed it. That growing absence behind her words, the smile that no longer reached her eyes, the affection that only arrived when you stopped questioning her patterns. The moment you began to reclaim your spine, she pulled away. Not because you changed, but because you stopped kneeling. And a man with boundaries is useless to a woman who thrives on control. So she left, or worse, stayed silent. You were addicted to her certainty, her routine, her warmth on command. But that warmth was conditional, a transaction, not a truth. And when you stopped paying in self-abandonment, the mask cracked, and so did the spell. It wasn't betrayal, it was clarity, raw, late, and unforgiving. You didn't lose love. You lost your illusion. She didn't become cold, you became awake, and that awakening hurt more than her absence, because now you have to face yourself. No more excuses, no more fantasies. Just the man in the mirror, finally realizing what he refused to see from the start. She was never loyal to you, she was loyal to the role you played. And when that role stopped feeding her, she vanished, not with a scream, but with indifference. Because use, not intimacy, was always the foundation. You mistook consistency for love. But her affection was transactional, a currency, not a gift. She smiled when you served. She withheld when you questioned. You weren't her partner, you were her function. Machiavelli would say, affection fades when leverage disappears, and you, once a useful tool, became a burden. Not because you changed, but because you started asking what you were building and why. And questions are dangerous to someone who thrives in your silence. Her love was never anchored in you. It was anchored in what you did for her. The favors, the emotional labor, the quiet compliance. And when you stopped bleeding on command, she found a new vein to open elsewhere. You kept chasing a ghost, not because she was good to you, but because she used to be. That's how psychological quicksand works. It pulls you back with memories, while reality is already gone. Stop feeding what only grows in your absence. She didn't disappear when things got hard. She disappeared when you stopped being easy. That's not abandonment, that's exposure. The real pain wasn't her departure. It was realizing how much of you was built around her moods. You adjusted, you predicted, you performed, until one day she no longer applauded, and you were left holding an identity that didn't belong to you. You weren't the end, you were the means. And once the means expired, the affection dried up. That's not tragedy, that's clarity. And clarity is what remains when illusion finally dies. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. You called it loyalty, but loyalty without boundaries is servitude. She didn't admire your devotion, she used it. Because when a man's love has no spine, it stops being sacred and starts being strategy. You thought staying meant strength, but staying without standards is silent consent. She didn't fear losing you. She relied on that, because usefulness disguised as love is the perfect trap for a man afraid to be alone. Machiavelli warned, predictability is a pawn's trait, and she played you like one, not with malice, with method. Every act of self-erasure you called commitment was just permission for her to stop trying. You offered peace. She interpreted it as permission. You stayed quiet to avoid conflict, and she interpreted it as weakness. A man who won't walk even when he's bleeding. This is how emotional manipulation works. It rewards compliance, punishes boundaries, and keeps the leash soft enough to confuse it with intimacy. She didn't love your depth. She loved how deep you'd bury your needs for hers. You gave her power every time you apologized for having limits. You bent your code to keep her close, and she stayed. Not out of love, but because you had become her cushion, soft, reliable, and invisible. Her loyalty wasn't love, it was leverage. She stayed until you asked for reciprocity, then suddenly you were too much. Not because you changed, but because you remembered your worth. You weren't her king, you were her strategy, and now you wonder why she left when you stopped performing. But the better question is, why did it take you this long to stop? You didn't find love, you found a place to hide. She wasn't your destiny, she was your anesthesia for the ache you refused to name. And that ache, it wasn't about her, it was about you. You wanted her to mean everything because you meant nothing to yourself. That's how the wound works. It disguises desperation as romance. You weren't chasing her heart, you were chasing your own absence. Machiavelli saw it before psychology ever did. Desperate men are easily manipulated. You gave her control and called it fate, because meaning feels divine, even when it's a lie, especially when you're starving. She didn't complete you. She filled the void you never sat with, the silence you never faced, the internal fracture you kept busy with her affection. You weren't in love, you were in recovery. Recovery from your own self-abandonment. You left yourself long before she did. And so she walked into the vacancy, like every fantasy does, dressed as salvation, built on a foundation of avoidance. The more you lost yourself, the more you worshipped her presence. Because when your identity is built on someone else's gaze, you'll do anything to keep it steady, even bleed for a ghost. You didn't need her to love you, you needed her to prove you were lovable. That's why you tolerated the contradictions, the manipulation, the quiet contempt. Because your soul was already bargaining for worth. A man must reclaim his throne or kneel forever, and that throne isn't external, it's internal. Sovereignty, spine, self. She wasn't your purpose, she was your mirror, and it's time you looked, not to chase her, but to reclaim yourself. She wasn't your ending, she was your mirror, and what you saw in her, the warmth, the chaos, the validation, was just the echo of what you lost in yourself. So stop asking why she changed. Ask why you silenced yourself to be chosen. Machiavelli said, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." But what if the fear he meant was the fear of a man who finally sees? What if everything you were looking for in her was just what you abandoned in yourself? The silence, the spine, the sovereignty, not to rule her, but to stop being ruled by your own ache. The game she played is over. Now it's your move. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and keep walking this path of brutal clarity, symbolic rebirth, and dark freedom. And if you think it's over, it's not. Because some women don't just take your power. They reflect the parts of you you've never faced. In the next video, you'll meet her. The one who doesn't complete you, but mirrors your shadow.